The presidency of George Bush Sr. is, depending on your politics, either funny or aggravating. It ended an unprecedented period of Republican dominance that came with the Reagan presidency. Not because attitudes changed to be less conservative as the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, no, that'd take time. Nor was it because Bush was uncharismatic or incompetent. No, the beginning of modern politics and the balance between Republicans and Democrats that we know today, in essence, began because George Bush said he wouldn't raise taxes. And then he did. That should tell you everything you need to know about American politics if you hadn't caught on already.
Life, liberty, the pursuit...
America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom.
And what's possible, building that more perfect union.
Joe Biden, meanwhile, was now a long way from his days as the young upstart that had overturned a Republican-dominated Delaware going into the 90s. Now on the wrong side of 40 and with a failed presidential run under his belt, he was thoroughly a part of the Democratic backbone and the political establishment. He wasn't unpopular. His success in repelling Reagan's influence in the Bork hearings still put him in the good books of most of his colleagues, and, as discussed, he was seen as a reasonable, negotiable man that was capable of reaching across the aisle. But the days of being the new kid on the block were long over. No, that, honour fell to, of all people, and this will sound odd to the younger people in the audience, Bill Clinton.
He was young. He'd been, he had avoided the draft in Vietnam. He was on one side, or seemed to be on one side, in the 1960s culture war. Of the boomer generation, he was in the kind of student protest camp and not in the going to Vietnam and voting for Richard Nixon camp. And in the Cold War era, if the Cold War hadn't ended in 1989, if we imagine some hypothetical that it had staggered on for a few more years, I don't think Bill Clinton would have stood a chance. I don't think he would have even got the Democratic nomination, never mind stood a chance in the general election. But the end of the Cold War freed up a space in American presidential politics for the kinds of candidates who wouldn't have had a shot earlier. I mean, that, by the way, also includes Donald Trump, right? It's inconceivable that someone as trivial a figure as Donald Trump, as insubstantial, unserious a figure as Donald Trump, would have been a serious contender during the Cold War era.
Clinton tries to disassociate himself from the old Democratic Party as such. He tries to, he is very clever at painting his Democratic Party as being the party to take America forward in the post-Cold War era.
For Biden, though, the 90s quickly turned into business as usual. There were scandals and controversies that passed through the US Senate, and the Judiciary Council was kept plenty busy, with even Biden commenting on the period's turbulence as it was happening. It didn't change, however, that through it all, even amongst the numerous, and I do mean numerous, scandals of the Clinton administration, none of it reflected too badly on Joe. He was, for this decade, a piece of white noise, just another politician you didn't pay too much mind. With an exception. In a nutshell, in 1993, an extremely controversial standoff between an armed cult and the FBI took place just outside the town of Waco, Texas, that would later be called the Waco Siege. The FBI fumbled their way through the conflict until a fire broke out on the cult's compound, resulting in over 80 people being killed, a healthy chunk of them being children whose parents were involved in the siege. It's an extremely complex topic that would deserve its own coverage. If I went into detail on how, why, and in what way it happened, I'd be here all day. But to put it lightly, it may well be the biggest black mark on the FBI's long and rocky history, at least as far as the general public are concerned. There are plenty of pieces you can find on it all over YouTube covering it in more detail. Needless to say, though, it managed to get the entire country pointing fingers, with allegations of negligence and incompetence being thrown at the federal government. But the following year, in response to Waco and a series of other spikes in violent crime, the government wanted to expand its influence in dealing with high-profile cases like this, and that meant cracking down on crime and anything that might abet crime, and beefing up federal law enforcement. In other words, the FBI, an organisation that some were saying had just gotten away with allowing a massacre to happen, were being handed a bigger stick. And who drafted the article this stick was wrapped in? Who drafted the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994? None other than Joe Biden. Well, him and the National Association of Police Officers, who Biden would later hand responsibility for the whole affair to. Tom Scotto, the head of the association at the time, agreed that he and his guys had been the ones to propose much of the bill's actions, but that Biden, who was overseeing the bill, didn't say no to any of it.
There was a real mix of stuff to it in terms of what we might think of as being quite liberal on crime policy, in terms of, but also in terms of punishment, being really quite a conservative, tough-minded hard on crime, whatever you want to phrase it. But in terms of sentencing, it sort of brought in stricter sentencing for federal crimes, which aren't the majority. Most criminal trials in the US are conducted at state and local level, not by the federal government. To the extent the federal government was involved in this, and particularly drug cases, it's harsher punishments. And Biden was a strong supporter, was a strong advocate for that bill in Senate at the time. This does come back in 2020. This is one of the areas where Sanders and others on the Democratic left sort of came to attack Biden for his role in that, and saying that this was one of the things which had contributed to mass incarceration, and particularly mass incarceration of Black young Black men. And even if this law itself, because of the limited impact, because it only applied to federal crimes, it wasn't responsible in numbers terms. It certainly contributed to an environment in which at state level, lots of states moved towards policies which were much stricter sentencing, and that 20 years on, it was clear how much damage some of these sentencing policies had done, particularly to the Black community, with young Black men serving a long time in prison for sometimes for pretty, what we would think of as minor drug offences, I guess, and how much damage that had caused, and that Biden had been part of that.
The 90s weren't done with Joe Biden, however, as in 1997 he took up the position of ranking minority member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. For the non-Americans or politically uninterested in the audience, that's a committee that deals with the foibles and legal scrutinizing of legislation that deals with the US's foreign relations. And when the Dems took a majority in the Senate, he became chairman of it. That happened a couple of times back and forth with the Judiciary Committee as well, by the way, I just didn't mention it. In his time with this committee, however, Biden did one thing much more noteworthy than simply chairing it. From 1993 to 99, Biden was actively involved in not just the legislation on, but the active negotiations with various countries in the Yugoslav wars. Now, I said that Waco was controversial, but me just talking about the Yugoslav wars and the ethnic tensions of the Balkans is liable to somehow make them even worse.
And then in terms of foreign policy issues, one of the key kind of international crises that Clinton had to face was the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, and then all the kind of the knock-on issues that occurred through the 90s. And again, in particular relation to Kosovo and what was going on there in the late 90s, Biden would have been really quite active in terms of kind of congressional pushing for the US to be more active in, acting against the Serbian forces, etc. So there's moments that are particularly important to Clinton as a president, where Biden is very much there having a meaningful input to kind of policy and to legislation.
Biden became animated in wanting to prosecute the crimes of the Serbian government's leadership, specifically those of Slobodan Milosevic, and vocally encouraged the US to intervene in any way possible during the conflict. He also, while this was going on, voted against the US's involvement in the Gulf War. Not because he was taking an anti-interventionist stance, mind you, but because he felt that the US was set to do all the work amongst the anti-Iraq coalition. This, and his later complete support of the US war in Afghanistan, became the groundwork for what Biden would be best known for in his vice presidentship.
He was much more interested in foreign policy, wanted to be on committees, senior figure on committees dealing with foreign policy in ways that many US senators simply don't. They'll engage with foreign policy at times like today, when there's a big international crisis where there might be some demand on them to speak out. But Biden had a consistent interest in foreign, international affairs, international politics throughout his Senate career.
But Obama gives him that opportunity, and that opportunity comes through a whole series of developments. But it reflects Obama's need for somebody who knows the ropes in Washington, somebody who's a foreign policy specialist, and somebody, of course, who bespeaks experience.
Interventionalism is something that only gets worse and worse press as the years go on, and indeed those in the Obama administration felt it did Biden no favours.
Probably the key foreign policy conversations and priorities for the Democrat Party, I guess, would have been an exit plan for Iraq, a clear exit plan, a drawdown plan for Afghanistan. So maybe not to kind of depart with the same kind of haste, but certainly to have, you know, a discussion about how to bring some bit of an end to it. Other things would have been about sort of trying to draw a close to what had become a very kind of untenable war on terror, and I use that kind of in inverted commas, and because clearly that was a sort of an unwinnable, open-ended, existential kind of a situation that the country had found itself in for like 7 years, and they were kind of tired because it wasn't really getting anywhere.
That Biden was offering perhaps a contrary voice to most of the advice that Obama was getting, that would often, not often, didn't happen often, so to say it happened often would be a mistake, but those leaks tended to be on foreign policy issues where Biden would take perhaps not a contrarian view, but a perspective which was sometimes more skeptical of US foreign policy intervention.
It was Obama who kind of clinched it in the sense of talking about that he was going to focus primarily on domestic issues because he realized everyone was exhausted from foreign policy, you know, the loss of blood and treasure and all the stuff that comes with wars. Obama himself comes in with really no experience in the realms of kind of foreign policy and those big kind of international issues. Biden is much more, he's the Chicago community organizer guy who's kind of shot to stardom and whatever. So he knows he has to fill the gaps that he can't fill himself in the early days. And Biden is like a really good choice in that regard, I think.
Biden remained popular amongst the Democratic Party's backbone. Now truly a senior authority amongst its members, his presence was seen as a stabilizing one, so much so that he became a natural choice for the Democratic Party to turn to after the Trump presidency. But with recent events being as extensively watched as they have been, I don't think I need to tell you about all that.